Today I'm going to introduce you to one of my all-time favorite woodworking techniques, bent wood lamination.
Hit it!
If you like to build furniture that has lots of curves and curved components, you're eventually going to confront a situation where a solid piece of wood just isn't going to cut it. For instance, this rocker, for a sculpted rocker, imagine doing this out of a solid piece of stock. You'd have a lot of end grain, short grain situations, and you'd need a very large piece of wood to do it. So we have to learn how to bend wood to our will. There's a couple different ways you can do it. Number one is steam bending, and that basically involves putting a workpiece into a steam chamber, and then after the wood fibers have sort of softened to some extent, you take it out, quickly get it into a form and clamp it down, and it's kind of like perming your hair in a way. You sort of put the water in and reset it in its new shape, and the lucky thing is I don't actually need a perm. I have naturally curly hair. Now, steam bending is great, but I don't really have a setup for that. So what I do most of the time is called bent wood lamination, and that involves taking a whole series of thin strips and then bending them to the shape that I want with adhesive between each layer. Now, if this were a solid piece of stock, I certainly would not be able to bend it, but because it consists of about 5 different layers here, I could easily bend this to whatever curve I need, of course, within reason, right? So if we're going to be bending this stuff, we need a form of the proper shape that we're going for. When I first learned about wood bending from my mentor, David MARC, I was always amazed and a little amused by how much effort he put into the form itself. But over the years, I've realized there's a good reason for that, because when you're bending wood, you can't take any chances. You have a lot of time and effort and money invested in that material, so you can't mess it up. All right, so let me show you how you build a good quality bending form. First, we'll need to transfer our pattern to a piece of 3/4 inch plywood using spray adhesive. Cut along the pattern line at the bandsaw. Using a rasp or spoke shave, fair the curve so that it's nice and smooth with no major hills or valleys, and finish it off with a flexible sanding strip. Now we need to make an accurate negative of the curve that we just created. Position the board onto a new piece of 3/4 inch plywood. Clamp it in place and set a scribe to the thickness of your lamination, which for me is 1 1/4 inches. I like to line my forms with 1/8 inch cork, so that's included in my number. Keeping the scribe perpendicular to the curve, run it along the length. And now we can cut out the negative part of our form. Use the pencil line as a guide, and try to stay as true to that pencil line as possible. All right, so here are the 2 starter pieces. We've got our base of the bending form, and this piece will go to make our calls. Essentially, it's the negative, if you will. But the thing is, you might be confused at this point as to why we had to mark in 1 1/4 inches. It comes down to the radius of the circle. So if we start with this piece, this is the primary one, right? This is a 42-inch radius. Think of this as if it were a giant circle. Now, if we go in 1 1/4 inches, from there we no longer have a 42-inch radius. We have 42 minus 1 1/4 inches. It's a smaller circle, right? So if we made this negative piece match up perfectly to this profile, then it would be also a 42-inch radius, which would not give us the proper clamping pressure and support where we need it when we actually are clamping 1 1/4 inches away from this shape. Right, so this is why we measure out 1 1/4 inches, so now we have a smaller radius circle on this piece for the negative, and that's going to give us the proper clamping pressure. Both parts of the form need to be thicker, so we'll glue each of them to another piece of plywood. Once the glue is dry, the excess is cut off at the bandsaw, leaving no more than 1/8 of an inch proud. Then the second piece of ply is flushed up to the first using a flush trim bit. If your lamination is really wide, you can keep adding subsequent layers of plywood using this method. I cut some scrap cork into strips and glue those to each face of our bending form. Keep in mind that this cork is completely optional, but when it comes to bending forms, it can be helpful to have a semi-flexible material between the form itself and the workpiece, as it helps distribute clamping pressure and makes up for imperfections in the form. Both sides of the press are covered completely in packing tape to help protect it from glue. On the primary part of the bending form, I'll attach 8 evenly spaced cleats. These cleats will raise the entire form up off the work surface, making it easier to clamp. And here's how the pieces of the form will come together. So with the form made, now we need to take our stock and cut some laminates. Now, how thick do you cut these pieces? Well, it kind of depends. Sometimes you have to think about the wood species. Some woods bend easier than others, and you have to think about the curve you're forcing it to bend into. The more severe the curve, the thinner the pieces have to be. So you're going to be somewhere between 1/8 of an inch and 1/4 inch, whatever the project will tolerate. And for me, usually I go a little bit over 1/8 of an inch, maybe up to 3/16 of an inch, and that's usually kind of a happy medium to aim for. But it usually does require a little bit of experimentation. All right, so let's slice these up. The lamination strips are cut to about 3/16 of an inch. I like to use a featherboard to help keep the material tight against the fence. After each cut, I take a very light cleanup pass at the jointer before cutting the next slice. This ensures that each strip is of a consistent thickness and has at least one clean face. Once your strips are all cut, you'll want to smooth them out and bring them to final thickness. I use a drum sander, but you can also use a planer and a shop-made sled. You can also use your table saw to cut the strips, where you could very well have a glue-ready surface right off the saw. Once you have your laminates ready, do a quick dry run with your bending form. Now when it comes to the adhesive for bent lamination, you've got a lot of options. Let me show you a few right here. Well, first I've got Unibond 800. This is DAP weldwood, and here's some West Systems epoxy. Now all three of these are great for bent lamination. They give you a nice rigid glue line, but the problem is they're sort of on the other end of the scale in terms of safety. I don't really like formaldehyde containing glues if I can avoid them, and epoxy is super expensive and you kind of develop a sensitivity to it the more you use it. So if I can avoid it, I'd like to, and there are other options. Many folks have no problem using standard PVA glues in bent laminations. What I have here is Titebond Extend. This gives me the extra working time that I need, but I have the normal safety that I'm used to with a typical glue that I have in the shop. Ultimately, you've got to make the right choice for you in your shop and what sort of safety you'll tolerate, what materials you want to work with. For me, I'm going with a Titebond Extend. And keep in mind, there's a lot of new formulations of PVA glues out there that are intended for laminations like this. So they've kind of tweaked the properties to be a little bit more appropriate for this work. Either way, whatever you choose, get your jig ready because we got to work pretty fast. Each strip receives glue as we build the stack. A glue roller is incredibly helpful here since the clock is ticking. The stack is then placed into the form, and I'll begin clamping at the center and working my way out from there. I'll flip the form up on end and apply a few more clamps to the other side, and that helps balance out that clamping pressure. All right, that is looking pretty good. I got plenty of squeeze out. You know, a lot of times we avoid squeeze out, but when it comes to a bent lamination, I want to see it. Squeeze out tells me I got glue between each layer, which is critical for this thing to not fall apart and delaminate over time. All right, it's the next morning and I removed the clamps. This piece slides off easy enough. And let's see what's going on here. It's probably going to be a little bit stuck, so grab your dead blow, just knock things around just a little bit. Should be all it takes. Wow, that is awesome. So as you can see, once you have all these techniques down, you're really only limited by your imagination, right? So I hope you give bent wood lamination a shot. Let me know how it works out for you.